In recent decades, the power of the Supreme Court has become monolithic. The most baffling story I have read in months was when the court decided it had the power to give over half of Oklahoma to a semi-sovereign nation because we supposedly violated a treaty 100 years ago. Now, I'm sure everyone watching this understands the problem with such a decision. However, the question follows of how do we deal with this sort of monolithic court power? Because it seems as though, based on how our politicians act, that there is no recourse for either the Congress or the president to deal with the court in almost any way. There is a way to deal with the court, and it's not that complicated. But over the years, particularly in conservative circles, we have discarded these functions because we believe them to be unconstitutional or against the constitutional order. However, that is not the case. They are, in fact, the exact checks and balances that were set up to check the judiciary's power, but we don't use them. The reason that conservatives particularly refuse to deal with the court? Respect. It's not as though the founders forgot to put checks on the judicial branch's power. There are quite a few, both explicitly and implicitly, laid in the Constitution. They just weren't used to the sort of frequency necessary to maintain their effectiveness in checking its power. American right has lifted up the court in recent decades to being an untouchable institution whose power may not be threatened unless the constitutional order is threatened at the core. Of course, all the while, that same court is lurching leftward every decade, with more and more completely ridiculous decisions that go right in the face of the constitutional order they so claim to protect. This tendency to keep things exactly as they are is very common among conservatives. But obviously, in this case, it has gone too far, especially over the last century, where the court has simply disregarded the Constitution as a document that has any meaning to its decisions. The most egregious example of this tendency to keep things as they are, in my opinion, is the complete unwillingness of those on the right to change the number of people on the Supreme Court. A credible threat to those currently on the court that their influence in the decisions made by it could be lessened or outright nullified by the nomination of new judges to the court, or, in more extreme cases, their outright removal from that court. There is no incentive for the court to remain nonpartisan and to remain loyal to the law. While there may be, in the beginning years of this sort of practice being reintroduced, a number of partisan judges getting on the court and then being summarily removed by the opposite party when the election year comes around, those who stay on the court for a long period of time will be the ones who are inoffensive, ones who don't change the law, ones who don't stick their noses into controversy. Exactly the sort of judges that conservatives supposedly want on the court. It would solve the problem in an instant. Oh yeah, and just a reminder to those screeching in the back, what about the constitutional order? Oh no. Might I ask if you've ever read that Constitution? There is nothing in that document which says anything about the number of justices that may or may not be on the court. There could be as little as 1 or as many as 1,000, and the Constitution would have absolutely nothing to say about it. Giving the other two branches of government, Congress and the President, plenary power over adding and removing judges at any time, make sure that the judges stay in line and never do anything controversial. Because if they do, well, that court's going to change pretty quickly now, isn't it? Their power is the most unstable and inconsistent of all the branches of government. Think about it. The Congress gets elected every 2 or 6 years, depending on which house you're in. The president gets elected every 4 years. That's a fairly consistent amount of time that you have. You have 4 years, you have 2 years, you have 6 years. But the court? Well, you could be on there for 50 years, or you could be on there for 6 months. It doesn't matter how long you're on there, you have no term. And for leads to my counter-argument against one of the major suggestions that's being placed nowadays, term limits on judges. Of course, this would defeat the point of how the judiciary is appointed. Now, it's important that the judges are not elected, they're appointed. They're not elected by the people. This is to prevent them from being an outright political body. Instead, they are elected by politicians rather than being politicians themselves, or at least ideally that's what they're supposed to be. However, term limits would prevent that from being particularly the case, because you'd have a consistent amount of time you'd be on the court. You'd be on it for 20 or 30 years. Well, in that 20 or 30 years, if an activist judge gets on, they'll use that 20 to 30 years to do whatever they want, as the same as politicians. They would use that 20 to 30 years, or as long as you give them, to do whatever they want, just like a normal politician. That sort of term limit would only exacerbate the problems that we already have, not limit them. But anyway, let's move on to our next point, and that is how you deal with individual decisions, particularly the president. As I stated before, people have too much respect for the court. This applies not only to how justices are put on the court, but also the decisions they bring down. An important but often overlooked portion of the Constitution with regard to the judiciary is their lack of ability to call on military power. The executive is the commander-in-chief, and thus obviously able to call on the military to do specific things, and the legislature has the power to declare wars and other such actions, and even outranks the president in certain instances. But the judiciary has no power to effectuate their decisions. This has resulted many times over the years of presidents simply ignoring the court when the decision was out of line. Abraham Lincoln completely ignored the Dred Scott decision in order to abolish slavery, and the court, of course, could do nothing about it. Thus, all of the power the judiciary has to effectuate any decision that they make is derived from the respect they hold in the minds of the public and in the politicians, as I've stated before. So, just a question. Do you believe that the court currently deserves that respect you hold for them? Remember, just a few months ago, they gave away half of Oklahoma. They don't deserve your respect. Stop giving it to them. All the president needs to do when the court does something like refuse to allow him to rescind an executive order that his predecessor put into place, like with the DACA decision, is simply ignore them, because they don't truly have any power. They cannot effectuate that decision. And for those in the audience, stop giving the court more respect than it deserves. I'm out. Watch Kamen Rider.